was I tempted and tried. Human Word became flesh, bore my sin and death. Now you're risen. Everything I once held dear, I count it all as lost. Lead me to the cross where your love poured out. Bring me to my knees, Lord, I lay me down. Rid me of myself, and I belong to you. Oh, lead me to the cross, to your heart, to your heart. Lead me to your heart. Lead me to your heart. Lead me to the cross where your love poured out. Bring me to my knees, Lord, I lay me down. Rid me of myself, and I belong to you. Oh, lead me to the cross. Savior, I come, quiet my soul. Remember,
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line: "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi. And she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter
Going to cut it off. Ooh, wow, I'm real loud. Maybe it's that. I'm going to cut it off there. I apologize. Message over. You guys can go home. Just kidding. Believe it or not, every time I've tried to do this, it's taken me about an hour. So you could be in overtime this morning. Oh, this is awkward. I apologize. I'm just going to drop it in my pocket. Hopefully that works. Good morning. How is everyone this morning? Good. It's good to see you guys. I want to start this morning with a quote from Nate Wilson. He's an author and somebody I really respect and kind of listen into. Actually, I've done a study here at the chapel before with college students that he wrote. It was called The Notes from a Tilt-A-Whirl. It's a really great study if you ever have time. It's a fantastic book, but he made a argument in a podcast recently that I was listening to, and he said, logical arguments will never move anybody. Narrative causes are what move us through life. And I thought this was a really profound statement, especially coming from a day and age where we're so analytical, right? We spend so much time worrying about numbers and figures and really constructing solid, sound logic that we can kind of like shove in other people's faces and hope to make them agree with us for some reason. And that's not how people are moved. People are typically moved through narrative story. It's philosophy permeating through the depths of story that tends to kind of reach us in our heart, right? And it kind of tugs on those heartstrings a bit. And it begins to move us in a specific direction. And I want you to kind of think about that this morning as we're going to be going through chapter 3, starting in verse 10 of Ruth. So kind of with that thought, my wife and I got in a conversation this week, and it's interesting because all great stories, and Ruth is a great story, has some significant depth and layers attached to it. And there were 3 very specific layers that I noticed as I was kind of reading through Ruth. The first is like the actual just narrative layer of Ruth, right? Like, so you have a character Ruth and you have a character Boaz, and they're going about their business and their lives get interconnected together. And we get to watch and kind of read that story play out. But then there's a second layer that's taking place in the book of Ruth. And that is the story of Jesus Christ coming and redeeming you and I. And he does that very specifically. I'm not great on history. I'm going to guess around like 33 AD or somewhere around there. But he comes here to earth, God incarnate, right? And he comes, has an entire ministry, and dies on a cross and raises himself from the grave. And that is a very real story, right? So that's the second layer, the second story that's being told in the book of Ruth. But there's actually kind of a third layer that's actually being told throughout the entire book. And that's your and my story. Because as you begin to see today, and I hope you begin to see this, you can very clearly begin to insert yourself, and myself included, as a very real character in the character of Ruth. And there is a very real Redeemer at play, and his name is Jesus. And you're going to see Boaz, and Jay talked about this last week, this typological character. Boaz acting as a redeemer, acting as Messiah Jesus, and redeeming Ruth from the place that she's currently in. So this is my big question as teachers. We often have to write these in our lesson plans. I don't typically, but sometimes I do. And my big question for you this morning is, if I wanted you to understand a significant event that would happen years later, like years down the line, how would I do that? If I was, trying to get you to understand something. And I'm sure here in 2023, we'd probably whip out a cell phone, do a TikTok, record a selfie video or something. And, that's going to last forever, right? Okay, I'm going to start with a story that I've probably already told you guys. I'm going to try again. I'm going to pull out my notes. I need notes on this story because I tend to screw it up, as my wife at least tells me. This is my proposal story, which you would think that I would have that one down by now. So I should have been at church, is how the story started. In fact, it was about 17 years ago, pretty close to this time. My wife and I, not wife at the time, girlfriend at the time, we had decided to go skiing up at Seven Springs. And we were making our way back. It was a Sunday morning, and we had stayed over at a friend's house. And so we were making our way back. Again, should have been to church. We were not. And a lot of things probably could have been avoided that day if I would have just made it here. And so we're driving in my 1989 Volkswagen Jetta. And this thing is like a box on wheels, and it's a very old box on wheels. It was a 5-speed box on wheels, though, so it was kind of fun. And this is just backstory information. We were driving kind of through a little bit of a snowstorm, and the windshield wiper actually had popped off in a prior event. And in my stupidity, I got out of the car and put like a sock on the windshield wiper, thinking that was going to fix it for some reason. Just so you know, a sock does not fix. It is not a windshield wiper. It just smears it and just makes it that much worse. I never fixed it though, because I'm just lazy and I let it go. And so we're driving back through a snowstorm and it's just smearing the snow. So we had to stop every 10 minutes. And I had a lot of time to think in this very long drive that should have been a lot shorter. And I began to think about my future. In a year, I kind of knew, me being a super senior the following year, and my wife, because she's much smarter than me, was graduating a year early, that we were going to both graduate around the same time. And since that was true, I began thinking, what would our future look like if it was together? And so I kind of began exploring that as a question. Here's where I need the notes because everything gets really confusing. I kind of asked her something along the lines of hey, next year we graduate. I guess I'm just looking to know if you were interested in, making this thing a little bit more permanent. Again, in my mind, this is very exploratory. I'm just feeling things out here. In her mind, that was not what I was doing. And she said, yeah, that sounds good. And I was like, good. And she said, you do realize you just proposed to me. And I was like, what? And she's like, yeah, that's what that was. That was a proposal. And I was like, no, it wasn't. And she's like, absolutely, it was. And I was like, well, you need to be careful and not count your chickens before they're hatched, which was a poor thing to say because that threw her into a fury. And I'm sure every man here knows what a mad woman looks like. She went past mad into straight crazy, and didn't. And I'm telling you, crazy Michelle is terrifying. Like, this is a true story also. One day I made her really angry. She ran all the way to Rice's Landing and back in another snowstorm, but I didn't see her for like 5 hours. I had no idea where she was until I get a phone call, and she's just like, I'm so cold. Can you come and get me? That's the kind of crazy we're dealing with here. And so she ends up, when we make it back, and it was an icy car ride back to Waynesburg University, and we make it back, and she says, I'm going to go study. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go rethink my entire life. And so I go back to my dorm room. She goes back, and apparently she's studying, and hours later, I was like, I need to figure out what's going on. So I text her, and I was like, hey, I think we should talk. And she's like, I'm running. And I knew she was in the fitness center, which is your Chick-fil-A now. My fitness center at the time had racquetball courts. It was very cool. I don't know the trade-off, Chick-fil-A or racquetball courts. But I went down, and I kind of stood next to her treadmill and kind of pressed the stop button. I was like, I think we should maybe talk this one out, because it feels like this is awkward, and it wasn't supposed to be. And so she's like, okay, I'll talk. And so we went to the most romantic place that we could find, which was the stairwell directly next to the Chick-fil-A. So if you've ever gone out the right door of the Chick-fil-A, there is a stairwell that goes up to the gym. It looks like a dungeon stairwell. It probably was a dungeon stairwell back in like the 1800s. I'm sure that's what they built it for. Led straight to, there's like 50 layers of paint. It's just painted on dirt. And it is a really disgusting place. And she and I sat down there. And I remember we had a conversation that looked something along the lines of, look, I think you got me wrong. I was just trying to see what our future looked like. And she was like, you definitely proposed. And she said, and I'm going to quote it here because she wrote it down very specifically. Yeah, don't need crazy. She explained, I'm still trying to think of my life as a single person, so don't go talking about that unless you're serious. And my reply was, oh, you're worried about me being serious? Oh, that was never a question. Like, I never bought you a ring, and I never asked your dad for permission, but would you marry me? Like, it was a no-brainer in my head. And she was like, yeah. And that's really the end of the story. I mean, we end up getting married while still in college, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it ended happy. And one of the things about my proposal story that I've always kind of realized is it's super uncharacteristic. Like, anybody in here who has proposed recently, Colin, I don't know, did you plan it out, or did you just go in that day and wing it? Because I wung it for sure. And one of the things I know about this is it's undeniably our story. Like, nobody else probably has that story, I'm guessing. But it's still a universally recognized symbol. Like, nobody would deny that there was actually a proposal that took place there that day. And everybody knows that that proposal is an image for two people who are committing to each other to one day get married. And so here's what I knew. I knew without a doubt I loved her. And there was this reckless abandon that just kind of took over during the course of the day. And it was this willingness, and this is the picture I need you to see for the rest of the morning. It was a willingness to just throw myself at the feet of the one that I loved. Okay. So we're picking up, and I know I showed you the video, and I showed you the video on purpose. We're picking up at the part where Boaz just woke up. It's kind of an awkward scene. He just woke up. He's startled. And he says, who are you? And Ruth answers, at his feet, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are the redeemed. You are the Redeemer. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet, there is a redeemer nearer than I. Okay, so I want to just kind of park on this verse for just a couple minutes. I love the wording here. It says, spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. This isn't just a vague request. This is Ruth very actively proposing to Boaz. That's what this is. So I want to make sure that's really, really clear. She's asking that he not only redeem her and Naomi, but essentially marry her and take her as a wife. So I know this is probably really awkward wording nowadays. We don't typically go about it this way. But this is the idea, and I like the wording here because you have this idea of like, spread your wings over your servant, like this idea of like a bird spreading their wings over like a child, right? Like a baby bird. I think it's actually probably very similar imagery to that you see in Matthew 23, verses 37, where Jesus is talking about, he says, I want to spread my wings over you like a mother hen would spread their wings over a child. And so there's kind of this image being presented here of Ruth at the feet of Boaz. And I think there's this, my sweet daughter, there's this image of a proposal happening. And it's really interesting. I don't know if you know where we get our modern proposal image, like the getting down on one knee and extending a ring and asking. But that's actually like a very medieval idea. The idea of a servant coming to a noble, a lord, or a king and bending their knee and really in service to someone that they love. And so that proposal now has kind of like become our deal, right? And so I want you to see the image of a proposal, the current image that we have now as of really bending the knee as an act of servitude, right? And so she's asking to be provided for. Verse 13, remain tonight and in the morning. If he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. And I don't think Boaz actually means that. I don't know, just from my experience in this story, it does seem like Boaz is like pretty into Ruth. I don't know how excited he would be if the nearer redeemer would, actually say, yeah, you know what? I think I'm going to take this opportunity. I think Boaz is probably like just an honorable, righteous man. And so he's just like, if he does, I'll accept it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until morning. And so she lay at his feet until the morning. I remember when Elsie was first born. We had a really, really good birthing experience. I mean, I wasn't the one giving birth, but I was there for it. And it seemed like it was a good experience. I felt like Michelle was very comfortable. The midwife center was an excellent place to deliver. Everything about it was just so much smoother than when we were in the hospital. And so for the first 5 minutes of Elsie's life, everything was just calm, peaceful, and just wonderful. It really was. It was just wonderful. And then I remember she opened her eye and Michelle looked at the doctor and was like, I think something's wrong here. I think something's wrong with her eye. And it was like the world flipped upside down in a second. It was just like everything happened very, very quickly after that. The doctor they did her blood sugar, and she was like, it's 22, which apparently is really low. They didn't panic, and I didn't know any better until much later that that's actually a really low blood sugar level, apparently. And the doctor was like, yes, there does seem to be something, that looks to be wrong with her eye. And all of a sudden, I'm on an ambulance headed for Children's Hospital, and I'm being, taken with my daughter. My wife had to stay at it. It was the craziest thing. We're being taken up to the NICU unit. And we get there, and the first person I'm really introduced to is who will be her eye surgeon in future events. And he takes me aside, And he looks at her for, it couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. And he comes back to me and he says, I've got some really good news. And I was like, that's what I need. I need some really good news right now because this has been crazy. And he's like, your daughter is going to live a perfectly normal life because she can see out of her one eye. She'll never be able to see out of her other one, though. And I don't know, that probably seems like it's not calm and comforting news, but when you're in like the throes of pandemonium, that's actually like a pretty good promise. And I'll actually take it at that point. Like, she's going to live a normal life because she has a good eye. And I'll tell you what, like, you don't sleep that night because you're up all night thinking about life and the worries that life can bring. And I think this is kind of probably where Ruth is. She's been given a promise, and it's a good promise. She's going to be taken care of for the rest of her life. But there's still a lot up in the air at this point. Like, she doesn't know if it's going to be Boaz, the man she's come to love, who's going to redeem her, or if it's going to be some other guy. She doesn't know really what's happening. And I'm just imagining her at the feet of Boaz as she's sleeping that night, probably not sleeping. I'm guessing they're both probably not sleeping. It's probably one of those like what is going to happen tomorrow? And there's anxiety filled. And I think this is like the epitome of like what faith looks like. We've been given like a promise, and it's been an excellent promise really on our end. And though life can be like crazy, and we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, that there is an eternal promise that's been extended to us. And we should have some rest in that promise. Verse 14. So she laid at his feet until morning, but arose before one could recognize the other and said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Before one could recognize the other, I was reading, this is interesting. The Hebrew literal is probably before one could recognize a friend. I thought that was just an interesting side note. But this is obviously done as a service to her dignity, her integrity, her character, who she is. We know that Boaz is calling her noble and worthy, depending on your translation. But it's not only Boaz who thinks this, it's the rest of the community. The rest of the town knows that she is a noble and worthy woman. And so Boaz probably understands the consequences that go with this. Because as Jay kind of mentioned, this probably has the appearance of what could be a bit scandalous. And if we're thinking, I'm just imagining like going through Boaz's head. He knows who the relative is, right? He's even the one who says like there's a relative nearer or a redeemer nearer than me. So he probably knows exactly who this is. He probably knows exactly how this thing has to play out. And my guess is he doesn't want to manipulate or misconstrue or cause some sort of deception within the appearance of what's actually taking place. Because there was nothing scandalous about what happened, but the appearance of what could look scandalous could ruin everything. This is really petty, but I think it's probably the same picture. When I was in college, one of the things that would happen is early in the morning you'd be walking up to go grab breakfast or something, and you would see a girl walking back from a guy's dorm. And often it's petty, and it's probably not like a just accusation, but we entitled it the walk of shame, right? Because there was the appearance of something that could have been scandalous taking place. And again, not my place to put it in there, but obviously as Christians, we want to avoid those situations if we can, right? We want to avoid any accusation that could come from anywhere else. The image is just as important sometimes as being clean itself. Verse 15, we're going to spend some time here too. It doesn't look like there's going to be a lot in here, but there's a lot in here. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it. And he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. And then he went into the city, then she went into the city. The New King James Version suggests the term ephah here. And so if you're using a New King James, you might see that in your Bible instead of the word measure. But ephah actually is probably a mistranslation because it means a bushel. My guess is she's not carrying 6 bushels of barley back with her unless she is a tractor, and I don't think she is. So my guess is most translations try to use like a more vague term measure. Not that it's super important, but I thought it was interesting as I came across it. And it's not as important as why she's bringing back these 6 measures of barley. My first thought is she's carrying barley because it gives her a little bit of a different appearance. And this is like maybe more of a secondary thought, but I think it's still important. If she's coming back and she's spotted by someone and she's in her best, right, like her best gown and shawl, she's coming back and it can look maybe dicey. But if she's coming back carrying some grain, it might have a totally different appearance to the community. That's just a first thought. But the second is definitely true because you're going to see this in verse 16, 17, and 18, is the gift would have been very specifically given to Naomi. And why is Ruth is a widow. And so a widowed mother, which Naomi is also, would have been the one to give consent to any sort of marriage. And so this is essentially an engagement gift. Like Boaz is giving Naomi an engagement gift here for Ruth's hand in marriage, which is really interesting because of the next part. There are some specifics that the Bible gives us. It is 6 measures of barley. And that can seem like nothing in passing, but I kind of stopped on this and I began to wonder, why 6 measures and why barley? It's pretty specific. I am not one to like jump into like the numbers of the Bible and like try to decode things, but I thought that this symbolism was actually quite relevant. And so the number 6 kind of stood out, and here's why. I came across this quote by E.W. Bullinger, and it says, it has to do with man. The number 6 has to do with man. It's the number of imperfection, the human number, the number as man, as destitute of God, without Christ. As he says, it's certain that man was created on the 6th day, and thus he has the number 6 impressed upon him. Moreover, 6 days were appointed to him for his labor. So we can view 6 as a number for labor or work. While one day, that would be the 7th day, is associated in the sovereignty with God as his rest. So let's talk about where Ruth's been a little bit, because her history matters. Number 1, she is a widow. She's lost all of her family, essentially, except for Naomi. She left her parents, siblings, we don't know, and she's lost her husband. She is a Moabite, which means she's a foreigner in the land of Israel. Essentially, she is an outcast. She's not just a foreigner, she is a Moabite foreigner, an enemy of Israel. And so, again, this outcast image has been placed upon her. She is a woman. In the ancient Middle East, women did not have very many rights. Though Judaism, especially in Israel, provided quite a bit of rights for women, there still wasn't the amount of rights that a man would have in a predominantly male culture. And she has to work really hard for everything that she has. We see from the beginning of Ruth chapter 1 all the way until Ruth chapter 3 that she's been working the fields, she's been gleaning, not only to provide for herself, but to provide for Naomi as well. And now, she's being offered rest. It's probably the first time in a long time she's had that opportunity just to see in the future rest coming. And just consider what Boaz is basically offering to her here, right? She was a widow, but she won't be any longer if Boaz marries her. She was a Moabite foreigner, but she'll soon have citizenship in Israel. She is still going to be a woman. That's not going to change, but she will have a voice and she will have rights under Boaz. And now she doesn't have to work the fields for herself or Naomi. She's going to be provided for. There's an extension being provided for her there. I'm going to try to do my best to create this picture. All of Scripture is pointing to Jesus. From Genesis chapter 1 to Revelation 22, all of it is pointing to one significant character, and that is Jesus, Messiah. And as you begin to read through Scripture, there's something that kind of pops up again and again. It's this number 6 that's been built into the Old Testament. You see it in Genesis 1. The Lord worked for 6 days, creating all of creation, and on the 7th he rested. You have this in the 10 Commandments, that you are to keep the Sabbath holy because it is a day of rest. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its produce, but the 7th year you shall let it rest. You shall do this with your vineyards and your olive groves. 6 days you shall work, and on the 7th day you shall rest. This is from Exodus. If I wanted you to understand a significant event that's going to happen years later, potentially 1,000 years later, how am I going to get you to recognize that event when it takes place? And the answer is divine foreshadowing. The Lord is giving you hints and clues in Scripture, all throughout Scripture, in every story that you read throughout Scripture, that is going to allude to something that is going to take place much later. And what Boaz is offering Ruth here is a sign of rest. The 6 is symbolic, that very soon her work, all the toil that she's doing in the fields, providing for Naomi, it's going to be coming very soon to an end, because there is a Redeemer at hand. And he is acting as that Redeemer. He is acting as the 7th measure of barley for Ruth and Naomi. And this is our story too. Though we toil here on planet Earth, though we work here, and it's not always easy, we have an eternal rest that is going to be provided for us by our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. He is the 7th measure of barley for us. And maybe you're not into my number 6 symbolism, and that's okay. But I think there's another thing that takes place here that's really important, that's symbolic, and that you need to see. It's this image of barley being presented, because it's a symbol of fullness. Like when we think about barley and what it is, barley is provision for anyone who takes it. It was known as the poor man's wheat. It was always the first crop that came up during the year. And this is actually really important, because the first crop that came up during the year, they would have a celebration of the first fruits, which you can find in Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23 reads, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you and reap its harvest, you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of that harvest to the priest." This is a foreshadowed image of the true first fruit. And Paul picks up on this really, really quickly in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, "But now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits, the first barley of those of you who have fallen asleep. For since by man came death," and so you and I, men, women, we are inevitably going to die. "But by man, capital M there, Jesus, also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. But each one in his own order, Christ, the first fruits, and afterwards those who are Christ at his coming." Again, this is 1 Corinthians 15. I think the celebration of the first fruits was always a celebration of provision. It was always recognizing the first fruit that came from the harvest, and it was being offered back to the Lord. Jesus is the first fruit that was offered. He was the first to rise from the dead. And we were talking about this a little bit this morning in Breaking of Bread. But this is a declaration of his divinity. No man or woman ever in the history of mankind rose themselves from the grave. He is divine. He is God, and only God could raise himself. And this is his victory is also our victory over death. And so in the story of Ruth, when we're seeing this, she has been granted this image of provision, as you see with barley. And so her sign that is being given to her and Naomi is of 6 measures of barley. Her redemption is rest and provision that's coming. And that is our promise as well. And so the next part of this in 15 is interesting too. It says, and she went into the city. It's interesting because the she there is actually often misrepresented. The Hebrew is actually masculine he, but it often gets mistranslated to she because Ruth was actually the last person involved in the situation, whatever as the story is being told. And so we do this in English all the time. If the subject or the direct object is continuing on into the next sentence, we just follow along with the same pronoun. But there's actually a pronoun switch that happens in the Hebrew. And it actually reads he. And I think this actually makes more sense when we're looking at the imagery of the entire verse here. If we read it as he went into the city, then it is Boaz who is entering into the city on behalf of Ruth as a redeemer. He's the one who's entering in just as Christ enters into Jerusalem on our behalf as a redeemer. And 6 days does the work for us. And on the 7th day is raised from the dead. Ruth 3:16 through 18. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these 3 verses. I wish I had more time, but it appears that it is running out very quickly. And so verses 16 says, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave me, and he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And she replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but he will settle the matter today. I think what's really interesting in this and all of this is that word, I guess you can't see my blinker, is that word rest right there. It's interesting that he is willing to continue to work so that he can provide her the rest. He's willing to not rest so that she can be given rest. I want us to go back to the beginning of where I started, our proposal story. And I think we're presented with this really uncomfortable image of Boaz is sleeping and Ruth is like at her feet. And it's this act of submission that kind of doesn't sit well. It might seem awkward at first, like we're reading it, but then it just kind of just is unsettling. And I think it doesn't sit well with us where we are in 2023 because of, this idea of the man as the patriarchy and women being submissive at the feet of a man that doesn't, right? But I think there's a lot more to it than that. I think the real reason it doesn't sit well with us is because it's a reflection of us. Like we live our lives as though we don't need any sort of redeemer at all. Like in our culture in America, we love the idea of independence. We love the idea that we can do it ourselves and we don't need anybody else's help. And if we need to figure something out, we're going to pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps and we will make certain that we can get it done. The idea of having somebody else step into that role for us just seems not great. But I want us to consider that our place is actually submissively at the feet of Jesus Christ. If we are the metaphorical picture of Ruth in this story, what do we have to offer God that isn't actually already his? Right? Like what can you bring to the table to save yourself? Have you ever thought about that? Like what do you have right now? Like what are you going to offer up to him that he needs from you? Yeah, that's kind of how I feel too. Like I got like a cool house kind of, and my car's all right. That's the best I can do. Like seriously, that's the best I can do. And the other thing is we're all foreigners in his land. Actually, it's really interesting because if you go back to the Redeemer passage that you can find in Leviticus, where it actually talks about the kinsman redeemer, the Lord very specifically says that you are foreigners, sojourners in my land. You're using my land. It's not even yours. So you actually have the responsibility to redeem my land. We're all strangers in the Lord's land. We're only going to be here a short time, and it's not ours. And yet he's actually chosen still to redeem us as foreigners with nothing to offer. And the only place that we really can show up is at his feet. And it makes me think about his submissiveness. He's our Lord, a mighty King and Creator, but yet he was submissive to the Father, laid himself at the feet of the Father, and put himself on a cross. Here's a couple verses just for reference. Luke 22:42 says, Father, if you were willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And this is an incredible image of what Jesus was willing to go through on our behalf. I think about all the time, Jay has made mention of this many times, but it's not the physical agony of going through death on the cross. Though if you read the book Dominion, just the preface by Tom Holland, it's incredible what the cross actually looked like. It was horrific. But it's not just the physical death on the cross that Christ is looking at here, but it's being removed from the Father's presence. That is what he did for us. John 6:38 says, for I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is submissiveness to the Father. Philippians 2:8 says, in being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. That is something that I don't exactly understand. And it brings me back again to this picture. Here's what I know. 17 years ago, as I'm like sitting in a stairwell with my future wife, I had no plans that day of like walking in, proposing to her. I really didn't know anything. It was completely unknown to me. The only thing that I did know was that I was like crazy in love with her. And I was willing to throw it all down in a second because it just made so much sense for my future and what my future looked like. And if I'm willing to throw all the cards in, all the cards on the table, I'm all in for this one girl, how much more should I be all in for Jesus, who sacrificed everything to give me everything, right? Like eternity. It's not just eternity with him. He's offered us being heirs with him on the throne. And just to consider, and if the band wants to come up, because I always forget, just to consider how much more reckless his love was for us. It's truly mind-blowing. And so I hope you'll stand with us as we sing Reckless Love.
Before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. took a breath, you breathe your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, He chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. When I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, He chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, He chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God.
Thank you for allowing us to be able to come here this morning to worship you together safely and freely as a church and as a family. And it really is an honor to be just among so many God-fearing, God-loving people. We thank you for all the blessings you've given us and you continue to give us throughout our daily lives. And we ask you to just please help us this coming week. Any students here that might have any upcoming exams or assignments, or anybody else that might run into any troubles or problems throughout the week, whether just during the day at home or at their work, we ask you to please just help us to realize that you're always watching us, you're always guiding over us, and that all we have to do is ask. Just pray to you, ask for your guidance,